Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 20. A Day of Relaxation and Girlfriends. Ruby was oddly peaceful as she lounged on the couch, her head finding a home on Blake's lap while Yang massaged her legs. After a battle that had left her entire body aching, it was nice to be spending the day relaxing. Thankfully, the Grimm also seemed to be giving the relentless attacks a break, though that was likely because they had defeated the Siren. Elders had a nasty habit of attracting Grimm, so they were always the priority in a fight as, if left alone, they would simply call for backup. The Siren also explained why the Grimm had been so frequent. The help being around was bad enough, but a second Elder would have been real bad had it not been dealt with so quickly. Her entire body being in pain for a day or two was a worthy price to pay. Her aching body also meant she had an excuse to be closer to Blake. She wasn't sure if it was because the girl had almost died, but things felt a little easier. Sure, she still had the image of a completely naked Blake in her head thanks to the Siren's song, but the smaller things that used to cause her to pause seemed to not bother her anymore. It had surprised her most last night, when she effortlessly gave Blake a kiss goodnight and didn't even realize she had done it until she got to her room. However, as much as she was enjoying being tended to by her sister and her girlfriend, that did come with some pain whenever either of them made the slightest of movements. Like the movement Blake made to reach for the remote control to change the channel, which dragged a groan from Ruby's throat.
"That's what you get for doing Strawberry Sunrise,"
Blake said disapprovingly.
"We really need to rework that move."
Yang breathed, her fingers digging deeper into Ruby's calves.
"The move is fine. Right, Rubes?" "Yeah, Maxie, ow."
Ruby, forgetting that her arms were also sore, had thrown her arms into the air and immediately regretted it. Returning them to their previous position on the couch, she let out a small hiss.
"Maximum power. Maximum bone breaking if you screw up."
Blake scolded them both.
"Nah, we've been working on it for years."
Yang scoffed.
"Beside, we only use it in emergencies."
Blake simply shook her head with a sigh and changed the channel to the main news network. However, as the broadcaster went over the goings-on in Vale, Ruby felt her girlfriend's hand graze the tips of her hair. Though it caused her some pain, she shifted her head a little closer to the hand and gave Blake a grin, causing the girl to roll her eyes. Nevertheless, the hand quickly began to weave through her hair, and a relaxed feeling came over her. Laying there in her relaxed state, listening to the Lisa Lavender go over the business news as Blake and Yang soothed her aching body, Ruby mulled over what they had done after the fight. Once Blake was in bed and taking it easy, Ruby insisted that she go to the relay office to report the barricade breach personally, but Yang had firmly put her foot down and refused to let her leave the house. It was a good thing too, as, less than 10 minutes later, her legs had given out. So instead of walking, Ruby had simply called the relay office instead and spent most of the day sitting down.
"Employment rates are down by 2% dash."
Admittedly, she was getting a little restless, but the fact Blake had recovered quickly and her pampering was more than enough to make up for her lack of mobility. Despite the faunus repeatedly scolding her, Blake had also been feeding her cookies and fetching her milk when the glass was empty. It felt a little childish, but Ruby didn't care that much. She liked what she liked.
That feels nice,"
Ruby hummed as Yang dug a thumb into her calf muscles and circled it.
"Tuxin's book trade is having dash. Me or Blake?"
The blonde chuckled, her eyes snapping open as her face heated up, as did Blake's from the look of things.
"Blake,"
Ruby said smugly and stuck her tongue out, knowing immediately that she shouldn't have challenged Yang.
"Then I guess I better give you to the room?"
Both Ruby and Blake flushed a dark scarlet that time, and Yang let out a victorious laugh. However, the girl thankfully didn't move and continued to massage her legs.
"In news outside of Vale, a string of dust robberies dash."
"Shush," Blake said with a grin and threw a cushion at Yang, who caught it with ease.
"You're always so embarrassed." "White fan were caught as the Vacuo police responded to an incident."
Blake cut off at those words and her smile faltered as she turned to look at the television. Having heard it too, Ruby and Yang stayed quiet to hear the report.
"Police urge that there is no reason to panic, but remind you that should you see anything suspicious in other kingdoms, do not approach as the White Fang are known to be quite hostile. Instead, report it to your local precinct."
Without hesitation, Blake turned the channel to something else and let out a deep sigh. It was clear she was distressed at the news, so despite the pain, Ruby reached up and slipped her hand under Blake's. She seemed unwilling to look at either of them for a couple of minutes, but after some shifting of her hand, Ruby finally spoke.
"That's not you,"
she said gently.
"It used to be. But not anymore,"
Yang countered firmly.
"Yeah,"
she agreed.
"You know that doing stuff like that is wrong now. Those people are just criminals. They're misguided,"
Blake corrected her.
"and I don't know who's doing it. Sienna is okay with violence, but this doesn't seem like something she would authorize." "Sienna?"
Ruby asked, having never heard the name before.
"The person who took over when the old leader stepped down."
Ruby heard the stutter, the correction that showed Blake had almost slipped up. She was curious what it meant, but she also knew it wasn't her place to intrude on something so personal. Blake would tell her when she was ready.
"This can't be her." "Then maybe it isn't."
Yang shrugged.
"Might not even be actual white fan members. Your old uniform isn't exactly hard to copy, and people really love blaming Faunus for stuff." "Yeah, it could just be a mistake,"
Ruby agreed. Blake didn't seem convinced, but she gave a nod anyway and looked down, the girl's amber eyes meeting her own silver ones. Without hesitation, Ruby gave her a smile, and after a couple of seconds, received one in return. Knowing one smile always led to another with Blake, Ruby considered it a success and let the hand holding Blake's drop to her stomach so that her aching arm could have a rest. However, with her arm aching so much, her aim was off and her hand landed a little higher than intended, instead coming to a rest on her ribs. It took a lot of effort to not let her eyes fly wide open at the realization of where Blake's hand now was. It was close to a certain area, but she couldn't move it without it being very clear why. Thankfully, Blake seemed to have her own ideas of where her hand should be and slowly dragged it over to where Ruby had originally intended it to be. Though that time Ruby had to keep her eyes from shutting at the pleasure Blake's fingers sent rushing through her, and it was because her eyes were still open that she saw Blake purposely looking away from her. The kisses, they're easy, they were things they'd done already, but what about the things that hinted to what the future held? It was those things that were still weird between them. The little things like the close calls, the almost touches and glimpses that still made things awkward. She was very aware that Blake was holding back. She knew what kind of books the girl enjoyed after all, but it wasn't just Blake. When everything had died down yesterday, when the Faunus was in bed and Ruby was on the couch, Ruby had thought back to what she'd done during the fight. She'd ripped open Blake's catsuit and seen more than she had before. Hell, she'd done more than see, she'd touched. Her hands had been right there, and the thoughts that came to her mind may have been amplified by the siren's song. The siren couldn't create those feelings. They used what was already there, and they were clearly there for Ruby. The thoughts teased her, and caused her mind to race, and her cheeks to blush.
"Dear Raalm, you two are S."
Whatever they were, Ruby certainly wouldn't find out any time soon as they all heard the front door open. Pain shot through her as Yang instantly jumped to her feet, her gauntlets extended, and ready to fight whatever had intruded. Her stance quickly faltered, however, as a male voice called from the hallways, the humorous tone exceedingly familiar to Ruby.
"Do I keep my head if I poke it out to say hello?"
Regaining her composure, Yang thrust her arm back, and the audible sound of the Ember Celica's reload mechanism echoing around the room as a shell was locked into place.
"Only if you brought me something?" How about 10 lean?"
their father said, his hand coming into view holding the money, only to be pulled back after Yang cocked her gauntlets again.
Right. How about coupon for 20% off at... No, you shouldn't be buying alcohol at your age."
"Oh,
I know."
A large groan came from the hallway, as if their dad was lifting something heavy, followed by a small squeak as a small girl was placed in the doorway. The expression on her face was one of shy uncertainty, and her rabbit ears were folded at the tips.
"How about a cute girlfriend I found at the docks?"
Once Velvet was in view, Yang lowered her stance and returned her gauntlets to their collapsed form, the loud whirring earning a sigh of relief from the hallway. A wide grin overtook both their faces, and Yang quickly made her way over to the Faunus, both pulling each other into a hug.
"The perfect gift. Thank Raalm for that, cause I had nothing else."
Ty chuckled as he walked past them and into the room. He looked tired but happy. His usually scraggly beard was longer due to the week's traveling, and his hair was a mess, though that wasn't out of the norm. His clothes were muddy and even torn in a few places, but other than that, he looked fine. He must have dropped his weapon off in the hallway though, as she didn't see it anywhere. However, before he could get far past the doorway, Yang reached out a hand and stopped him with a snap of her fingers. He gave a short roll of his eyes before placing the lean in her hand, and he was finally allowed entry. "There's my little petal," he said as he approached Ruby and Blake, his arms open wide. "Doesn't your dad get a hug after his long and arduous mission?" Ruby hummed nervously, still in a little pain from where Yang had moved so fast. "I am giving you one in my head." Ty scowled at her for a minute, and then gave a shake of his head. Ruby knew he didn't like their team move either, that he considered it reckless and a waste of aura, but Ruby and Yang were rather proud of the raw power of it. "That stupid move," he sighed, and dropped his arms before turning to Blake. "You must be Blake Belladonna? It's good to finally meet you." Ruby felt the hand on her stomach leave instantly, and she immediately missed its warmth. She felt Blake's legs tense up a little, and could tell she was nervous about not only meeting a new person, but meeting her girlfriend's father. It was also telling of her nerves that, while she had moved the hand from her stomach, she hadn't removed her hand from Ruby's, so they were still holding hands as she offered hers out to greet him. "It's an I." Blake noticed Ty's eyes lock onto the joined hands, and quickly released them. "It's nice to meet you too, Mr. Xiaolong. Please call me Ty." He smiled kindly and took Blake's hand, though it quickly turned to the same mischievous grin that Ruby feared from Yang. "Though from the way my daughter is clinging to you, you might be calling me Dad soon." While Ruby and Blake both blushed, a snort of laughter came from Yang as the girl finally pulled away from her girlfriend and moved into the room. Velvet's nerves seemed to have subsided now the joke was over, and she gave them both a smile as Yang led her back to the couch and sat down, the rabbit faunus happily sitting on her lap as the blonde's hands wrapped around her. "Nice one, Dad," she chuckled. "Having two people around to tease them will be so much more fun. For you maybe? 3 actually," Velvet corrected her girlfriend. "Coco will be here in 2 days. Sounds like we have a full house." Ty grinned, ignoring both Ruby's and Blake's groan. "What about your 4th member? Wise?" "Not sure yet," Ruby replied, her hand dropping back to her stomach, which filled with butterflies as Blake's hand found it again. "We're hoping she can get back soon though." "Got it," he breathed as he sat down in the comfy, one-person chair that he always occupied. "So what were you fighting that left you in that state anyway?" The three of them filled Ty and Velvet in on everything that had happened with the siren. With each detail, her dad seemed to look more and more worried, even letting out a low, sad sigh when they told him about Pearl. Once they were done, he let a hand run through his messy hair and shook his head, while taking a couple of minutes to think. Clearly the news of a Grimm getting through the barricade had disturbed him. "That poor family," he said miserably after a while. "Linda's father recently passed away too. Did you report the breach?" "Ruby did," Yang replied with a nod. "They said they're sending someone out tomorrow," she confirmed. "Apparently a lot of huntsmen are being called to Vale's borders at the minute, so that was the earliest they could send anyone." "Not surprising," he said with a yawn. "Grimm grow in strength with every day they're alive. Time is never on our side, and sometimes it feels like we are just delaying the inevitable. That just means we need to get stronger," Ruby said with a wide smile, hoping to cheer her father up. Thankfully it seemed to work, and her dad gave her a brief smile. "Your mom used to say the same. Oz has a plan, she'd always tell us. She was never one to give up hope. And she was right not to," Yang said with a firm nod, everyone in the room mimicking her action. "Though trusting Ashbin? Not too sure on that one." "You still don't like him?" Velvet asked. "Something about him feels off." "That's just Oz," Ty reassured her. "He's rather aloof, and I don't agree with everything he does, but he does have good intentions, Yang." We'll see." Yang not trusting Ashbin always confused Ruby. To her, he seemed like a good guy. He had led her into Beacon early, and always took an active role in tutoring the students. He was also a prodigy, the youngest headmaster ever appointed to any school with an incredible track record. Sure, he was a little mysterious and secretive, but so were most adults. As far as she was concerned, he obviously had reasons for hiding the things he knew. Besides, they could hardly be world-changing things, or the world would already know about them. "Anyway,
I haven't slept since yesterday morning, so I'm going to bed for a nap.
Ty sighed, pushing himself off the chair.
I need to be up and rested to help check the barricades tomorrow anyway. See you all later, and if Yon gives you two any trouble, you have my permission to wake me up to fight her. From the looks of that vital tournament footage, she needs the practice anyway.
Without looking, he caught the cushion that was thrown at him and, without any loss of movement, brought it around his body and released it so fast that it hit the blonde in the face before she could catch it. All that was heard was a soft chuckle as he left the room.
So how's Coco?
Ruby asked Velvet when her dad was out of the room.
She's fine,
the bunny fauness said with a smile as Yang straightened her hair out.
Her and Mate are going to see Toma for a couple of days. Then she's heading over. I thought her and Mate weren't talking,
Yang asked.
Pretty sure that's why Toma wanted them over. Well, hopefully they sort it out,
Blake offered.
From what she had mentioned, he's mainly just upset she's putting herself at risk. MHM,
Velvet said with a hum.
So how have things been here? Yang said Grimm have been attacking quite frequently. Not counting the siren, just some lesser Grimm,
Ruby replied dismissively. The next 30 minutes passed with the group exchanging small talk. Velvet told them about the small mission her team had undertaken at Vale's wall where she guarded a new shipment of dust from the Grimm, while Ruby informed her about everything else that had happened. Despite seeing the girl's eyes dart to where Blake's hand was, she didn't mention it, and Ruby was thankful that the girl tended to not intrude on personal things. Gods knew that Coco would certainly not show the same courtesy when she arrived. However, once they were all caught up, and Yang clearly began vying for attention by nuzzling her face into the nook of Velvet's neck and causing the fauness to giggle, the girl rolled her eyes and leaned in to whisper something to Yang. A small grin spread across the blonde face as she gave a nod, and Velvet prepared to get up.
We're gonna head up to my room too. I haven't called Coco since before the fight,
Yang said as Velvet lifted off her lap, pushing herself up to slip an arm around the smiling fauness' shoulders.
Don't you two do anything we wouldn't. That's not exactly very restricting,
Blake countered.
She does have a point,
Velvet giggled.
Wow,
Yang exclaimed, her hand going to her chest in mock insult.
And here I was thinking of using the lien I just earned to buy you a carrot cake. Oh, you are definitely still buying me that,
Velvet argued, pulling the blonde away.
Goodbye you too. Later,
they both replied as the sulking blonde and grinning fauness left the room as well. With everyone gone, even the television couldn't make up for noise they took with them. Not quite knowing how to break it, Ruby simply laid there in the quiet as Blake's fingers slowly ran through her hair. Though awkward at first, it quickly became a nice feeling and Ruby found her eyes closing to enjoy the attention further. The peace was easily one she sank into, as those moments were what they often sought at Beacon. Those small little meetings where they sat alone in an unused classroom and ate lunch, the quiet afternoons in the plaza when Yang and Weiss were sparring with whatever strong opponent they had chosen that day. As she laid there, she realized how much she missed those moments. Being back at the house had been great, but Yang was around all the time and there were no other students for her to challenge to fights, so those moments were nowhere to be found. However, with Velvet having arrived for the rest of the vacation and Coco arriving soon, Ruby knew her sister would be so busy that she would be able to drag Blake away for some more private moments. She could already imagine the places she could take her. Gratitude Ruins on the West Lookout, Breathing Hill, a little boring in comparison, but maybe even the small arcade and movie place that always showed the old black and white films that Ruby knew Blake loved. Yeah, cuddling up in a dark movie theater sounded a little cliché, but it had to be cliché for a reason. She could just imagine it. The dark room, the old romance movie playing as they cuddled on the couches that the owner preferred over individual chairs, popcorn, and maybe even pizza from the store next door to it. It was exceedingly simple, but so was Ruby.
You're a little quiet,
she heard Blake say, the girl's hand still gently toying with her hair.
What are you thinking about? Spots I can take you on the island,
she admitted with a smile.
Oh, gotta whisk me away somewhere Yang can't interrupt us. Maybe.
She grinned up at the fauness, earning a slight chuckle from her. Enjoying the sound of Blake's laughter, Ruby tightened her grip on the girl's hand and felt it respond in kind. However, feeling the fingers graze against her stomach caused it to flinch, and Blake's laughter quickly began to fade. Instead, her face became slightly more serious and contemplative. Though she preferred her girlfriend to be laughing, she couldn't help but marvel at how quickly Blake could switch from happy to serious, and vice versa.
You really trust going somewhere alone with me after yesterday?
Her marvel faded at that question, replaced with confusion, as she had no idea what almost dying had to do with her trusting being around her.
Huh? I looked up the siren this morning in your dad's bestiary.
Blake sighed, her hand pausing at stroking as the gold eyes filled with remorse.
They trigger desire, and are more effective on people with more of it. I'm trying my best to control them, and am letting you take things at your own pace, but when I was presented with the choice yesterday, I couldn't resist it. And because of that, you were down a team member for the fight.
And we still won, Ruby said immediately.
And you weren't the only one it affected, Blake.
With a groan, Ruby forced herself into a sitting position and turned on her sulking girlfriend. The pain the movement caused didn't matter, as she wasn't about to let Blake blame herself for something a Grimm had done to her.
But I was affected the most, Ruby.
Blake sighed and slowly stood up to pace the room a little.
Me suppressing stuff and the annoyance at how I feel, how I'm so fixated and easily obsessing over something that I shouldn't care about yet. It's those negative emotions that made me an easy target. I heard it the moment we started our search and didn't pick up on it despite knowing that there could be something around. I caught my mind wandering and suspected nothing. I said nothing. And I almost died. Yang had to save me by jumping in freezing cold water and then protect us while you helped me. She could have died too doing either one of those things. I put you both at risk. We're at risk every day,
Ruby breathed.
But it was never because of me.
Blake's voice was firm as she turned, her amber eyes glowing.
Everyone around me gets hurt. I'm scared that will happen to you, or Yang, or Weiss. I know that.
Ruby sighed, reaching out a hand and stifling the grunt of pain as she pulled the girl back into her seat.
And I can't say we won't ever get hurt, but I can say that we will never care. You once told me that if you died by a mistake of mine, you would be fine knowing I would use it as a lesson to make sure no one died the same way again. Yesterday was my mistake. I had all the clues I needed to figure it out what it was, but I didn't because I had faith in our barricades. That doesn't change that fact. I was still the most affected for a reason. You were the most affected, but anyone could have been chosen. Me, Yang, even Weiss if she were her. All of us have desires. But you dad's best. Blake, my dad's bestiary is outdated.
She cut the girl off firmly.
Sirens don't trigger it, they amplify it. So it doesn't matter how much desire you have for something, they will keep amplifying it until it's all you can think about. You were the focus of its song for a while without knowing it was there. With that much time, even I would have fallen for it. But you didn't. Because I was already fighting it by the time it turned its song on me properly.
Ruby countered with a shake of her head.
That doesn't mean it didn't show me things. Even when I was tending to you, I thought things, and they even tempted me despite the danger.
Ruby felt a heat rise in her cheeks as she prepared to address the other things Blake had said. She wasn't too sure how to go about it without embarrassing herself immensely, but clearly Blake was struggling with those feelings, and she wanted to put an end to that. She wanted Blake to be herself, and Ruby was very aware of who that was.
And as for you trying to control those feelings, I don't want you to.
Ruby breathed, seeing Blake's head immediately snap around to face her, and knowing she should explain better.
I mean, I'm not ready for that or anything like that, but I don't mind you trying to take things further than we are.
What?
I'm new to this.
Ruby shrugged and gave her girlfriend a sheepish smile.
And those situations are a little awkward for me because I have no idea what I'm doing. So I might need a little help getting to them. Oh. Yeah.
Both of them were silent for a while, as they processed what had just been acknowledged. Ruby had essentially just given Blake the green light to be the one who tried to take their relationship to those next levels, but she knew if it was only her doing it alone then it would take forever. And Ruby didn't want that. Sure, she was a while away from such things, but that certainly didn't mean she didn't already want them eventually, or think about them regularly.
Are you sure about that?
Blake asked cautiously.
MHM,
Ruby replied with a nod.
Nothing too fast, but I'm fine. No, I want you to feel comfortable helping me work out things. All right.
Blake stuttered, a small hint of red tinting her cheeks now. Silence followed as the understanding settled in for both of them. Squeezing Blake's hand firmly, she turned to look at her, and the moment their eyes connected, Blake moved in. It took less than a second for the lips to connect, and the kiss was far more than anything Ruby had felt before. All of their previous ones were careful and a little reserved, them testing uncharted waters to see if they were warm or cold, but the one she was currently experiencing was full of heat and passion. Blake's lips were pressed firmly against hers. A hand was on her cheek, and Ruby could feel the short breaths that left the girl's nose brush over her face. It wasn't a kiss that left her lips tingling like all the others, but one that left them burning. Burning for more. Her body realized that before her mind did, and was already responding to its own desires. She pressed in closer and found that the pain in her body had subsided, or more likely that her mind turned off the sensation because it had more important things to experience. She could feel the lips on hers, taste the apple she'd eaten for lunch, she could hear the breaths the girl was taking through her nose, and even her delicate floral smell filled Ruby's nose. The only sense that wasn't filled with Blake was her sight, and that was only because Ruby was physically unable to keep her eyes open as pleasure shot through her body. And just like that, it ended as quickly as it began. Blake's lips were no longer on hers, and she already missed them. Ruby could still feel it, her lips aching for a return to the actions that had taken place seconds before, but she knew Blake was now in control of herself again. Clearly, at Ruby's own words, the girl had willingly let that control drop for a second to show what that permission was allowing. As she opened her eyes, they were met once again by amber orbs. The orbs held a little worry in them, a nervousness that what had been done was too much. But it wasn't. The only thing the kiss had proved was that Ruby had made the right decision, so she was happy to see her girlfriend let out a sigh of relief at the smile she was given. Glad that hurdle was finally over, Ruby let out a sigh of her own and turned back around to lay on her girlfriend's lap, and felt Blake's hand immediately return to her hair. To anyone who walked in, it would look like nothing had happened, but it had. And Ruby couldn't wait to see what the newest change would bring about. Chapter 21. Gratitude Ruins. The forest smelled stronger than usual, though Blake suspected that because she was incredibly happy. The day had started off incredibly, as she woke to sun beaming through her window, the weather itself actually rather warm compared to the last week. It may have still been chilly, but at least she was able to opt out of wearing a jacket. The second thing that happened to make her happy was that Ruby was completely healed. The energetic brunette had already recovered enough the night before to jog into the kitchen for more cookies, but that morning she had chosen to show she was all better by using her semblance to dash into the kitchen and do laps around the table, finally concluding with a loud TDA as she posed before them. The last thing that made her happy was a discussion that had happened the day before, and she had barely stopped smiling since. As much as she hated to admit it, Yang was right. Coming clean to Ruby about her feelings had been the right choice, and as soon as she did, she felt a weight lift off her shoulder. Ruby had said that she didn't mind Blake advancing their relationship little by little, and though she was still adamant that Ruby would be the one to final say when those steps happened, Blake felt a little freer knowing the girl wanted her to help her slowly get to that point. She just wished it didn't take a near-death experience for those feelings to be put into the open. It was that freedom that made it so easy to smile as she walked through the forest, hand in hand with her girlfriend. She had no idea where Ruby was taking her. All she knew was that Ruby had decided to pull her away while Yang and Velda trained, though to be fair, she didn't really care. Ruby could have simply pulled her away for a walk and it would be just fine, but the fact that their direction hadn't changed at all meant the girl clearly had a destination in mind. The only thing Blake could tell was that they were heading west into a more densely packed forest. It was so dense, in fact, that the trees they were walking under were still full of leaves, and the ground felt much softer than in other parts of the island, as the heat was more insulated. The densely packed trees also worked wonders for keeping the grim at bay, as there was no real path to walk on. Instead, they were weaving their way through the small spaces between the trees, Blake holding onto Ruby's hand, both because it made her happy to do so, and because it stopped her from getting lost. However, 10 minutes later, after her brain ran out of things to think about, she asked a question that she knew probably wasn't going to get an answer to, but asked anyway with a small grin on her lips. "Where are we going, Ruby?" "Nope," the girl replied simply, and continued forward into the trees. "We are almost there anyway." "You said that 20 minutes ago?" she countered with a raised eyebrow. Is she actually lost? She wondered to herself as she knew it was a definite possibility with Ruby. "Yeah. I gotta turn around." Ruby chuckled nervously, though quickly turned back to flash her a look of confidence.
But we just passed a law that I know is on the way to the RU. Where we're going.
Shaking her head in slight sympathy, Blake found that she couldn't exactly be mad, because the more Ruby got lost, the longer they got to spend together away from everyone else, which was something she had missed in recent days. Plenty of memories had passed through her mind when she thought she was about to die. Her childhood, dancing with her father, listening to her mother talk about what she'd recently overheard from the neighbors, days out with Yang, studying with Weiss, who would always break after a while and engage in small talk, the days that Team RWBY had spent either lounging around or getting up to no good with Team JNPR, but at the very end was Ruby. It wasn't the training, or the loud happy giggling of them dancing either, but those quiet moments they spent tucked away talking. When Ruby would tell her of how she wanted nothing more than to simply save anyone she could, or to develop the world's most powerful superweapon. It was those small conversations that made Blake feel normal the most. In what she believed to be her final moments, her brain had decided to show her at her happiest. So when she lived and the fight was over, she decided she wanted more of those moments, and the only way to have them with awkwardness would be to come clean about what had been holding her back. Thankfully, she had found her worries were for naught, and just like always, Ruby quickly assuaged them.
Almost there,
she heard Ruby breath as the trees began to get further and further apart.
Still not sure where there is. You will see.
Ruby laughed and started to jog backwards towards the tree line that was just ahead.
This is the oldest thing on Patch. Apart from the island itself, obviously. I would assume that the island is older than everything on it,
Blake replied with a smirk, earning a stuck-out tongue from her girlfriend. However, the smirk was quickly wiped from her face as they stepped out of the woods, and Blake found herself questioning just how long they had been there. If it weren't for the odd rays of light that managed to break through the canopy overhead, she would have been convinced that night had fallen already. Thankfully, though, her night vision quickly took effect, and she saw that they were actually standing in a relatively small, circular clearing. The grass grew dark and green, and down the center of the clearing ran a thin, inclined path of cracked, yellow bricks. 6 stone braziers with a rail between them lined each side of the pathway, 3 per side, and looked like they could once be lit to guide the way to the house that stood at the end. Is house really the right word? Blake thought to herself as she inspected it from afar. There were certainly elements of a house to it, the basic shape that looked like someone had once lived there, but it appeared to have been built long ago. Cracked and crumbled rock composed a large majority of the structure, each one purposely placed, and speaking of such reverence for the original that it demanded the same from whoever looked upon it. It was very clearly a shrine to something, most likely whoever once lived there.
What is this?
She breathed. Not because she was breathless, but because she felt it would be rude to speak at any other volume than a whisper.
This is Gratitude Ruins.
Ruby smiled, her voice not quite as quiet as Blake's, but low enough that Blake knew she was right in that she should show respect for the place.
One of the oldest ruins in all of Vale. Really?
Blake asked, a little confused.
I've never heard of it. It's not in most books because it's small.
Ruby smiled, taking a small step forward.
But it's rather important to Patch. Well then.
She grinned and made to take a step forward, only for Ruby to tighten her grip and keep her in place.
If there are no books on it, then you will have to tell me the story. With pleasure,
Ruby replied and fiddled with one of her belt pouches to pull out a bunch of small, red dust crystals.
Should probably make sure I can see first. You want to do the other side for me? Sure. How do I do that?
Watching Ruby hold out her hand, she saw the crystals were actually roughly the size of a ping-pong ball. Knowing she should take them, she reached out to take the 4 that were offered to her and moved over to the other side. Up close, she could see the rod that connected the braziers was actually a little slanted with an opening at the end, and suddenly the spherical shape of the crystal she'd taken made sense. Glancing to her side, she saw Ruby holding one of her own pieces against the pipe and followed suit.
One at a time.
The girl smiled, holding up her other hand and extending a finger.
1.
Blake let the crystal roll into the pipe, and her enhanced hearing heard it stop a short distance away.
2.
Another ball was rolled into the tube, and this time she heard it stop a little further away from her, though she also heard a small clink as it hit the edge of the other dust fragment.
3.
2 clicks were heard, as the third ball rolled and eventually came to a stop further away than the other 2. However, there were only 3 braziers, So a little confused as to why she had a fourth ball, she looked to her girlfriend and saw the Reaper hold her own piece between her fingers and flow some aura into it. Coming to the realization that it was a chain reaction thing, she did the same and rolled the fourth, glowing ball into the tube at the same time Ruby did. The reaction didn't happen straight away. In fact, she had enough time to meet Ruby back in their original spot before anything happened, but she certainly didn't miss it when it did. She heard 6 clunks before she saw anything, but the moment she heard them, light blazed from the 6 braziers. With the new light, Blake could see glass in the sides of them, and from just how much they illuminated the area, she guessed the glass was specifically designed to amplify the light of the dust. And dear Raalm, was the area beautiful. The dark green grass was very overgrown, even poking through the chipped stone path, but sticking out of it were flowers of varying colors. The blades moved occasionally, but the ears that poked out told her that the cause was simply rabbits running around the area. However, the 2-story house itself was far more intact than Blake had originally thought. Among the stone construction were wooden slabs, old and broken, but still there. From what she could tell, the house used to be made mostly of wood, but a large majority of it had been replaced with stone. Windows lined the side, the thin glass that had once been held in the frames long since broken and lost to time, overlooking a porch. She could imagine how beautiful it would have been to sit out there when the building was in its prime, isolated from the world, enjoying the peace with a cup of tea and gentle conversation. The second story looked small compared to the first, the house itself only spacious enough for 2 people to live in, but another window was positioned there overlooking the area. Again, the glass was missing, and the frame was bent, but the shape was still discernible as a sideways eye. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, making sure her voice was just loud enough for Ruby to hear. "I can't wait to hear the story behind it." "It's not the happiest," Ruby said solemnly, and looked at the dilapidated house. "But I like it." Blake heard the Reaper take a deep breath and release it, and as the girl's hand slipped into her own, Blake held onto it and followed the small step forward that Ruby took onto the inclined path. "Thousands of years ago," Ruby began as she took her step towards the house, "the people of Patch used to worship a god. They would offer sacrifices, bring food and other offerings to appease him as they prayed for his protection from the Grim. For years they worshipped him and nothing happened, but they never lost faith. Then one day, a large Grim made its way into the settlement, but before it could do any damage, a bright green light filled the area and the Grim turned to smoke. Nobody knew what happened, and no one came forth, but they believe it was an act of God. They thought their God had finally graced them with his protection, rewarded them for their dedication. So they continued to give offerings, and every time a Grim would show up, the same green light would turn them to smoke. After decades passed, and new generations were born, they stopped fearing the Grim, feeling safe in the protection of their God." "I bet that was a mistake," Blake thought to herself. She could already tell that there was no God, but she didn't want to interrupt Ruby's story. Then one day, a man went missing. People were confused. It had never happened before. The Grim hadn't taken anyone since the first light. And things continued to get worse after that. While the light would still strike down the creatures of darkness, it was rarely before it damaged something or killed someone. People grew scared again. But then something even weirder happened. The first man to go missing, who everyone believed to be dead, returned. And with him, he brought a story. A story of an old man who lived alone in a house on the west of the island. He said that the man had saved him from the clutches of a beast, tended to his wounds, and nursed him back to health. When the people asked how the man was able to survive out there alone, he told them how he had witnessed the man fight with a green light produced from his staff. Ruby's fell face a little as they approached the middle of the path. But the people were scared. They had lost family members, felt their God had abandoned them. So they didn't believe him. Though the man tried to stop them, they gathered their pitchforks and sought out the house. It didn't take long to find the solitary home, and when they did, a wizened, old man stepped outside to greet them. But instead of returning his friendly gesture, they accused him of being a charlatan, a trickster who was trying to be a false god. They blamed his actions for their God abandoning them. He tried to calm them down, to explain himself, but with all that negativity, it didn't take long for the Grim to arrive. People immediately panicked, but the old man remained calm and produced a staff from nowhere. The clearing was filled with green light as he urged people into his home to get to safety. Once they were all safe, he fought off the Grim alone. But he was no longer a young man.
He was old and frail. Though he managed to kill all the Grimm, he was mortally wounded and died on the patio before any of them could even leave the house to help him. None of them knew what to make of it. They had seen him fight with green light, as their friend said, but they still had some faith in their god's existence. Nonetheless, he had died to save them, so they buried him at his home and gave their thanks. However, the green light never appeared again, Grimm attacks returned to normal, and they eventually realized they had to fight for their own lives. After another decade, they finally accepted that there was no god protecting them. They finally accepted that it was the old man that had protected them, that he had looked over them his whole life, and even died for them without ever asking for thanks. So they returned to his house once more to see that it was already falling apart, and so they worked to preserve it. It was their way of finally showing their gratitude to him for all he had done for them. As the story ended, they finally reached the last steps of the path. There was nothing left in front of them but the house, and where the door had likely once stood was a plinth with a small statue resting atop it. It was barely the size of her forearm, and terribly worn, but Blake could see it was a statue of the man in Ruby's tale from the staff in his hand. A staff that the man was using to keep himself upright, and was topped with a small, green chunk of glass jammed so tightly between the hands that the only way it would ever move would be to break the statue itself. They say the man he tended back to health carved that in his honor, the girl said with a finality that said the story was over. Blake liked the story. She had read others of its kind before, but most ended with the hero living, so she had always taken them with a grain of salt. Though while there were certainly parts that had to be exaggerated for effect, like the borderline magic that the story said the man used, she found it an easy one to believe. And from the loving way in which it had been told, it was clear the story meant a lot to Ruby too. He sounds like a huntsman born out of time, Blake chuckled, resisting the temptation to reach out and touch the staff. He sounds like you. He is part of the reason I became a huntress, Ruby said with a nod. It was one of the stories I remember Mom would tell me as a kid. When she died, Yang continued, and it was the one she would replace the hero with Mom the most. The story always resonated with me. The man had nothing, no family, no friends, no one to care for, so he cared for everyone. He spent his life making sure others could live theirs, and when the time came, he willingly sacrificed himself. He wasn't seeking praise or thanks, he just wanted people to be happy. Like I said, he sounds like you. Blake grinned, though her grin faltered a little as she remembered what Ruby had once told her. Even down to the part where he sacrificed himself. Everyone has something they are willing to die for, Blake. Ruby smiled, not a hint of remorse or fear in her voice at what she was saying. For Yang, it's me. For Weiss, it's the true honor of her name. For you, I'm guessing it's justice. But for me, it's just making sure people can go a little longer without feeling what it's like to lose someone. Whether that's the rest of their life or just one more day, I will be happy knowing I gave them that. But you also need to have something to live for, Blake replied, feeling it important to remind the selfless girl of that. I do, Ruby said and shuffled closer, her head coming to a rest on Blake's shoulder. I have you. And Yang. And Weiss. And all the other people I love. You all make every day incredible. Good, Blake breathed, letting her head fall against her girlfriend's. Because I'm going to make sure you never have to sacrifice yourself to give people that happiness. Okay, Ruby said with a happy nod, Blake feeling the hand leave hers and snake around her back. The two of them stood in silence for a minute, the sounds of birds and crickets echoing around them. Blake enjoyed the tranquility of the moment, the feel of Ruby close, and the smell of her strawberry shampoo drifting up to nose. However, after a moment of them both enjoyed the peace, she felt Ruby wriggling next to her. As she turned to see what she was doing, Blake saw a wrapped tuna sandwich being offered to her. Lunch? Sure, Blake replied with a roll of her eyes as she took the sandwich. Parting from each other, Blake watched Ruby sit down on the chipped stone steps that led to the front door. Though she hesitated for fear of being rude, she quickly put the feeling aside and sat down next to her as the girl rummaged through the largest pouch on her belt, pulling out another sandwich that looked to be chocolate spread. With a cute hum to herself, the Reaper unwrapped it and took a large bite. You really hate proper food, don't you? Blake chuckled, taking a bite of her own delicious tuna salad sandwich. What? Ruby said, her mouth full of copious amounts of chocolate. This is proper food. This is proper food.
Blake replied with a smile as she pulled out a piece of lettuce and held it up.
That is junk that will make you sick. Nuh-uh.
Ruby shook her head and stuck out her chocolate-covered tongue.
Besides, I used to eat that all the time, but when I activated my semblance, I started getting really, really tired. Your semblance burns energy?
Blake asked, curious as to why she had never heard that mentioned before.
Is that why you eat so much? MHM.
The girl replied with a nod.
I lost so much weight and was so tired. Then one day I had a brownie, and I was like POW.
Her arms did a karate chop to an invisible enemy.
I was so happy that I ran to town and back. Then you ate more brownies? The whole tray.
A laugh was pulled from Blake at just how happy the memory seemed to make Ruby. She had always known the girl loved sweets, and Weiss always told her off for not eating healthier. So to know that she was eating so much to keep her energy up actually made Blake feel better about sneaking so many packs of cookies into the secret bag she kept attached to her bed. Looking to her side, she saw Ruby happy enjoying the meal and felt a little mischievousness overtake her.
Can I have a taste?
She asked slowly when she saw Ruby finish her mouthful out of the corner of her eye.
Huh? Oh, sure.
Ruby held out the sandwich to her, and Blake reached out to taste it. However, that wasn't the source she wanted it from, so as her fingers slid around Ruby's wrist, she gently pulled her arm aside and swooped in. A small squeak escaped the girl at first as the taste of the chocolate that was on her lips exploded into Blake's mouth, but the squeak turned to a hum. Taking it as a sign that what she had done was okay, Blake pressed in a little further and breathed out softly through her nose. Feeling braver as Ruby pressed in closer too, Blake slipped a hand to the girl's waist and carefully pressed her tongue against her lips to ask for entry. She wasn't sure if it was too much, but she knew Ruby would tell her if it was. A rush of excitement ran through her, though, when she felt the lips part and Ruby's tongue pressed against hers. It was a cautious touch that made Blake smile a little. While Ruby was a decent kisser, it was obvious that she had no experience with any other action. She didn't want to tell Ruby she was using too much movement, so she pulled back a little and opened her eyes. After a second, Ruby's opened too, and Blake silently asked to take the lead. Thankfully, the girl seemed to understand, and Blake moved her hand from the Reaper's wrist to her cheek and pressed back in. With her in control, things were much better, and after a few kisses she tried to go further again. When she was granted entry, she let her tongue dance lightly over Ruby's, and the girl quickly got the hang of it. The sensation was amazing, even though the girl's inexperience was still obvious. Blake could feel the trust Ruby was putting in her, the gentle care the girl was taking to not mess up. She could feel the soft hums that she let out, the way her hand grabbed at her waist. She could taste and smell the chocolate that the girl loved so much as the sounds of the forest surrounded them. She actually feared she would get lost in the moment, but she didn't care. Sat in a serene forest clearing kissing Ruby? Could there be anything better to get lost in? She thought to herself, her hand slipping from the girl's cheek to push into her hair. However, it appeared she had finally hit that barrier that Ruby wasn't ready for as the red-headed Reaper let out a happy sigh and slowly pulled away. Though she didn't move too far, staying close enough that Blake could still hear her deep breathing.
Too much? And no,
Ruby breathed, a smile pulling at her lips as their forehead pressed together and Blake drank in the silver wells before her.
I think that's just where I am right now. Then that's where I am too,
Blake replied happily.
Was it? Was it good?
The girl asked with the same sheepish smile Blake had seen her give last night when she admitted to having no idea what she was doing.
Be honest.
Blake bit her lip, but quickly gave a nod.
Not the worst I've had.
Blake chuckled honestly, stroking her thumb down the cheek she was still holding.
But that was your first time doing that, and it's nothing that won't work itself out. As sore. I still enjoyed it,
Blake said with a small nod, her voice suddenly firm to cut off the unnecessary apology.
Me too,
Ruby said and bit her bottom lip. The moment it escaped the grip, Blake couldn't help herself but claim it with her own again. It wasn't a passionate kiss this time, just a regular one that she pulled away from quickly before temptation took her again, but a grin pulled at her face nonetheless.
I enjoyed the chocolate taste too,
she smirked, causing Ruby to laugh and pull away.
Well, the rest is mine.
She laughed and took another bite from the sandwich that looked a lot more squashed than when they had first started eating.
You have your stinky fish. Did you just?
Blake gasped with false insult and pulled her sandwich to her chest. Seeing Ruby stick out her tongue, Blake plucked a piece of tuna from her sandwich and flicked it at her, only for the girl in front of her to turn into roses and disappear in the blink of an eye. She knew where she would go though, as the countless hours training together had made the girl's movement second nature to her, so pulling another chunk out, she turned to her left flick it, only to feel something chocolatey hit her lip.
You little...
Blake began, wiping the spread away with her arm.
You said you liked it,
Ruby said smugly with another taunting poke of her tongue. Glaring playfully at the girl, Blake subtly adjusted the position of her legs. When they were in the position she needed, she flicked the tuna that was still on her finger at Ruby and, as the girl dodged, launched herself up to avoid the chocolate that came her way. She landed a short distance away on the path and threw another chunk at the laughing blur of red, but missed. As Ruby reformed on the path, Blake saw that this time she had a much bigger glob in hand and a wicked grin on her face, so used her semblance to dash back into the cover of the trees, where she could fade into the shadows. It worked and Ruby quickly began to look around for her, the laughter fading as a determination set upon her face. It was cute seeing her like that. Even in something as silly as a food fight, Ruby wanted to win, but so did Blake. So she circled the area for a minute, waiting for her moment to strike, which inevitably came. A rabbit ruffled a patch of grass, causing the waiting reaper to turn towards it, and, being in the girl's blind spot, that was the moment Blake chose to emerge from the woods. She was on the girl in seconds. As Ruby sensed the approach and turned to face her, Blake slipped one arm around her waist, while the other grabbed her wrist to stop any chocolatey retaliation. The two stumbled a little, Blake still holding Ruby, until they came to a stop against a tree, and before Blake even had time to think, her lips were back on Ruby's. All pretense was gone that time, and Blake kissed her with her true passion. An arm hooked around her neck to pull her closer, and she happily obliged, deepening the kiss as her body pressed against Ruby. The way she tasted, the way the kiss made her feel, it was almost enough to be addicted. All thought of control was lost, and her tongue came out to meet her girlfriend's in seconds. Though she made sure not to push the boundary they had just discovered, Blake wrestled with Ruby's tongue as pleasure shot through her. It felt good to not be restrained for once, to show Ruby just how wild she drove her. And Ruby clearly enjoyed it too, as she let out a groan of pleasure too. It was the groan that brought Blake to her senses though, as well as the teeth that bit down on her lip. She wasn't sure where Ruby had learned to apply the perfect pressure, but she looked forward to experiencing it again in a future makeout session. For now, however, she slowed her kiss down and pulled away. Both hers and Ruby's breathing labored.
Sorry,
Blake breathed shakily, not wanting to make excuses for what she had just done.
I couldn't resist.
Silver eyes opened, and she once again drank them in, vaguely aware that Ruby was smiling.
Good, I'm glad you didn't,
Ruby said softly after she gathered her own breath.
But Blake, you... what? You have something on your face. Huh?
It was Blake's mistake. The kiss had made her completely forget what had preluded, so as her hand came up to check what Ruby was on about, she sensed Ruby's hand swing up and collide with her face, sending chocolate spread everywhere. She was stunned for half a second, but as Ruby burst into fits of laughter, Blake felt a wide grin take over her face that quickly turned into laughter of her own. Wanting to share the cause, she rubbed her face against Ruby's and smeared the chocolate over her cheek as Ruby let out a humorous groan. It took a minute or two for the laughter to die down, but once it did, Blake let the hand that was still holding Ruby's waist relax so that the hold she had on the girl was much more gentle than previously. They were both a mess, covered in chocolate and dirt, but Blake couldn't remember ever being happier. However, she knew it had to come to an end as it was still winter, and it would begin to get dark soon. So with a reluctant sigh, she put some distance between their bodies and stepped back.
We should get back before the sun goes down,
she said, unable to keep the sadness about the date being over out of her voice.
Yeah,
Ruby breathed, maintaining her smile.
Yang is gonna make fun of us enough as it is. On second thought, can we just stay here tonight?
She asked jokingly, not looking forward to the teasing that would be waiting for them at home.
I think that will just make her mock us more.
Ruby laughed, taking a step forward.
Besides, our mission is tomorrow. Right,
Blake said with a nod, remembering that they were going to be protecting the funeral.
I guess it's an early night for us then. Yup. Then I suggest you lead the way home, leader.
Beaming down at her, Blake watched Ruby lean in and place a kiss on her. Just like last time, it was a restrained one, seconds long, and to simply say she was happy, but it made Blake's stomach fill with butterflies nonetheless. This time, however, there was no sadness when Ruby pulled away and began to pull her back into the woods so they could head home, and she knew why. Because it would not be the last time they shared a day like this, and she was more than happy to wait for the next one.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.